The moment they told me I was to be married to a human, I did not argue. I did not cry. I simply stood in the great glass hall of the alone Senate and looked out at the twin moons of our home world and accepted the news the way one accepts a minor wound, not pleasant but survivable. My name is Saravith, third daughter of the Alun High House, and I had been given to a war, not to man. To a war. The Vorkai Dominion had been eating civilizations for 11 years. They did not negotiate, they did not warn. They arrived at a system's edge. Broadcast a single phrase in every known language: you are now consumed, and then they burned everything in sight until the people either submitted or ceased to exist. 14 civilizations had joined the Galactic Concord to stop them. And for 11 years we had mostly failed. We had lost 40 star systems. We had lost billions of lives. We had held lines and retreated, held lines and retreated, until the lines no longer meant anything, and then someone in the High Council had the idea of bringing humanity into the war. Humans were a Tier 3 species. That is a polite way of saying young, rough around the edges, and barely worth the diplomatic paperwork. Their world had only reached stable interstellar travel 2 generations ago. Their fleet was small. Their ships, while sturdy, lacked the elegance of a loin design or the sheer massive Vorai warcraft. Most members of the Conquered viewed them the way one views a small energetic animal that has wandered into a formal gathering, amusing, perhaps useful for certain tasks, not to be taken seriously. The marriage was a political gesture. The Conquered needed humanity committed, not drifting in and out of the conflict on their own schedule, binding their highest active commander to a royal house would lock them in. It would also, my council explained gently, give me opportunity to observe their military conduct up close and report back. I was a spy dressed as a bride. I understood this. I accepted this too. His name was Commander Owen Calloway. I had read his file twice on the transport to the station where the ceremony would take place. 39 years old by human reckoning. Decorated in 3 separate border engagements before the Vorkai War began. Noted in 3 separate psychological evaluations as unconventional in tactical approach and resistant to direct command structure when he believes command structure is wrong. That last part had been highlighted by whoever prepared the file, apparently as a warning. I thought it might be the most interesting thing in the entire document. I met him for the first time 4 hours before the ceremony. The station was neutral ground, a spinning ring of a place that smelled of recycled air and machine oil. He was standing near one of the observation windows with a data pad in his hand, and he did not notice me for several seconds because he was reading. When he finally looked up, his expression did not change the way most beings' expressions change when they see an Elohim for the first time. We are tall. Our skin carries a faint bioluminescent pattern that shifts with our emotions. We have 4 arms, and our eyes are a solid deep violet with no visible white. Most species find us striking, some find us unsettling. Owen Calloway looked at me the way a person looks at someone they have been expecting, calm, attentive, no performance of reaction. He said, you must be Saravith, not your highness. Not a formal title, just my name. I told him. Yes, I told him I trusted the arrangements had been satisfactory. He said the room was fine and the food Options were limited, but he had managed. Then he asked me very directly whether I would prefer the ceremony to be shorter or longer, because he understood my time was valuable and he did not want to waste it on formalities I found meaningless. I did not know what to do with that question. In my world, formalities are never meaningless. They are the architecture of power. You do not skip them. You do not ask whether they are useful. They simply are. I told him shorter would be acceptable. He nodded and went back to his data pad. The ceremony lasted 11 minutes. Our joint signatures went into the Concord Treaty database, and humanity was officially bound to the war. Afterward, there was a small reception with officers from both sides. I watched Owen move through the room. He shook hands with everyone, human and alien alike. He mispronounced the Aloin greeting gesture slightly, curling the lower two fingers too early, but he tried it with every Aloin officer he met. And each time he did, I watched their expressions shift. Just a fraction, not to warmth but to something like reconsideration. He knew 3 alien languages, all imperfectly. He used all 3 that evening. Later, when the reception was finished and the station had gone quiet, I stood at the same observation window he had been at when I first saw him and looked out at the stars. My aide came to stand beside me and asked what I thought of him. I told her I did not yet know, that I would need more time. What I did not tell her was that I had expected a soldier shaped by pride and bluster, chest full of medals and a mouth full of simple answers. What I had found instead was a man who asked careful questions and watched everything and tried things he might fail at without seeming troubled by the possibility of failure. I had been trained my entire life to assess people quickly. It is a skill every royal child learns before they learn anything else, and Owen Calloway was the first person in a very long time who I could not assess quickly. That bothered me more than I was willing to admit. Over the following weeks, we traveled together aboard his flagship carrier called the Ardent, which was unremarkable in size but kept in a state of cleanliness and order that I found impressive for a human vessel. His crew numbered 412. He knew all of their names, not as a performance. He simply knew them. I tested this once, pointing at a young technician crossing a corridor ahead of us, and he said, without hesitation, Grayson Petty, officer from the coastal part of a country called Scotland. His grandmother still sends him food packages and he shares them with whoever is on shift. I asked how he kept track of so many people. He said, they're not a number to keep track of, they're the people I'm responsible for. It's different. I did not have an answer for that. In the Alone military, units are managed by rank and designation. Names are secondary. Individuals are components of a larger system. It is efficient. It works. But watching Owen Calloway walk through his ship, watching the way his crew moved when he was near, watching the particular kind of ease that existed between him and 400 people, I began to think that efficient was not the same as strong. He spent his evenings reading old books, human books, histories of wars fought centuries before humanity ever left their home planet, campaigns from places called Carthage and Waterloo and Midway and the Chosen Reservoir. Names that meant nothing to me, but he read them the way a craftsman studies the work of older craftsmen, searching for something, learning from people long Dead, I asked him once what he was looking for in those old stories. He looked up at me from the book, and for just a moment his expressions was more open than usual. Mistakes, he said. Everybody writes about what went right. I'm more interested in what went wrong. And why? I stood there in the doorway of his small quarters with that answer sitting in the air between us, and thought about the 14 civilizations that had been losing this war for 11 years. I thought about how many of our councils met to discuss what had gone wrong only after it had gone wrong, and never before. I went back to my own quarters and did not sleep well. 3 months into my time aboard the Ardent, a Vorkai scouting force hit a colony on the edge of Allen space. The colony was called VTH. Minor 14,000 people. They had 20 minutes of warning and almost nowhere to run. The Vorkai did not destroy the colony immediately. They took it, absorbed it, added its population to their labor pools. This was how they grew, not just by burning, by consuming. The conquered called an emergency war council. I attended beside Owen. The council chamber was full of admirals and generals from 9 different species, and every single one of them had the same plan: pull back, reinforce the next defensive line, wait for the Vorkai to overextend. Al sat quietly through the first 2 hours. He was the least decorated person in the room by conquered standards. His rank was respected but not revered. Several of the senior admirals spoke over him when he tried to contribute. I watched him let it happen, and I watched him take notes, and I tried to understand the patience in it. Then they called for a final vote on the retreat plan, and Owen stood up. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture dramatically. He put his notes on the table and said, "With respect, we are about to do the same thing we have done 17 times in the past 4 years, and I would like to take 3 minutes to explain why it will produce the same result." The chamber went quiet. He had 3 minutes of their reluctant attention, and I watched him use them with a precision that made me think of a surgeon. He did not insult the retreat plan. He did not mock the admirals who proposed it. He simply laid out step by step what the Vorai would do with the ground they gained, how it would accelerate their expansion, and where the defensive line would have to be drawn after the next retreat, and the one after that. Then he proposed something else entirely. He had been watching the debris field left by VTH Minor's orbital stations. He had been mapping the gravitational readings from a nearby collapsed star. He had been tracking Vorkai fleet movement patterns for 6 weeks and had found a repetition in their approach vectors that their commanders apparently did not know existed. He had, in 3 months of evening reading and quiet observation, built a complete picture of an opportunity that every senior admiral in that room had missed. They did not give him command of the counter-offensive. What they gave him was dismissal, politely worded. They told him his analysis was interesting. They told him they would take it under advisement. They voted for the retreat. And then, almost as an afterthought, one of the senior admirals said Owen could take a single human carrier group and operate independently if he wished. A consolation, a way to make him feel useful while the real work was done by experienced commanders. Owen accepted this without expression. He gathered notes. He thanked the council for their time. On the walk back to the Ardent, I fell into step beside him. I told him they had not listened. He said he knew I asked how he could be so calm about it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said they gave me what I actually needed. I just let them think it was a consolation prize. I stopped walking. He kept walking. I watched his back and thought about the 3 minutes he had been given in that chamber and the 6 weeks of work that had lived inside those 3 minutes and the 11 months of war, thinking that had preceded those 6 weeks. I had married a political token. That was what I had been told. Standing in that corridor, I began to wonder what exactly I had actually married. I told my aide that evening that I would be staying aboard the Ardent for the engagement. She reminded me this was outside the terms of my observation assignment. I told her the terms had been written by people who had not yet met Owen Calloway. I would be staying. She wrote it down without comment. Aboard the Ardent, something changed. The ease of the past months did not disappear, but it thinned the way warm air thins at altitude. The crew still laughed. They still shared food and told each other stories, but there was something beneath all of it now, sharpening, a settling into place. I watched them run simulations in the operations center for 7 hours without a break. I watched Owen walk through every station, asking questions, adjusting small things, never giving the impression that he doubted any of them, only that he wanted to know what they saw. I watched his pilot, a young woman named Claire Rowe with short dark hair and an unsettling habit of humming while she worked, run the approach vectors 40 separate times, 40, each one slightly different, each one noted, measured, kept. The Vorkai fleet detected us on the second day of approach. They were 200 ships, we were 12. Their commander sent the standard demand. The words translated to something close to stop moving and prepare to be processed. Owen read the message on the bridge display. Then he looked at his communications officer, a calm older man named Felix. Strand said, "Send back, we have been waiting for you." That was all, nothing more. I stood at the edge of the bridge and watched the stars outside the viewport and thought about a candle sitting at the base of a mountain, small and quiet and burning with complete indifference to the size of everything around it. I did not sleep that night. For the first time in my adult life, I was not certain what was coming, and I found to my great surprise that the uncertainty did not feel like fear. It felt like standing at the beginning of something. The battle began at 3:40 station time. I know this because Felix Strand announced it over the ship channel in the same tone of voice he used to announce meal rotations and maintenance schedules, calm, informative, as though 200 ships bearing down on 12 was a matter of routine administration. I had positioned myself at the back of the bridge. I had a clear view of the main display, which showed our 12 vessels as small white markers and the Vorkai fleet as a dense red mass moving toward us in the formation they used for every engagement. It was called the crushing wall by conquered analysts. 2 rows of heavy warships forming a broad front with lighter vessels filling in the gaps in a command cluster at the rear. It worked because it worked. It had broken fleets 4 times our size in open space. Owen was standing at the center of the bridge with his hands behind his back, watching the display. He had not sat down. He had said very little since the Vore acknowledged our return message with an acceleration of their formation. He had simply watched and adjusted small things and waited. I did not understand the waiting. Every trained military instinct in my low mind said the moment to act was now before the Vorai closed the distance before their numbers could fully press against us, but our 12 ships were not moving. They held their position in the debris field surrounded by the tumbling fragments of Vet Miner's orbital stations, pieces of metal and shattered docking arms, and the frozen remnants of fuel tanks the size of small buildings. The Vorkai commander, apparently concluding that we were either malfunctioning or very foolish, pressed forward without any adjustment to the formation. Why would they adjust? They had a wall of ships. We had 12. There was no logical reason to be cautious. This was, I would later understand, the first of 3 sumps Owen had counted on. The making, he spoke quietly to Claire. Row at the pilot station, she nodded and entered something into her panel. Then he walked to Felix Strand and said something I could not hear. Felix touched his earpiece and murmured into it. Nothing visible happened for 90 seconds, then a section of the debris field ahead of the Vorhi formation simply vanished in light. Not an explosion, not quite. It was more precise than that. 53 drone mines that had been positioned among the debris over the previous 30 hours detonated. A sequence so fast it looked simultaneous but was not. Owen had arranged them to create a pressure wave that traveled diagonally through the Vorkai front line rather than directly into it. The conquered analysts watching from the command relay station later told me they had never seen an explosive pattern shaped like a corridor before. It was shaped like a corridor because Owen wanted the Vorai ships on the left side of the formation to push right to avoid it. He had predicted they would do this because their formation doctrine always prioritized protecting the command cluster, which was offset slightly to the right. Pushing right meant pushing together. Pushing together meant the gaps between their ships closed. Closed gaps meant they could not maneuver independently. 3 of our 12 ships had been sitting perfectly still in positions that looked on any tactical display like defensive holdings. They were not defensive holdings, they were the walls of the corridor. When they Vorai formation, those 3 ships were suddenly on the flanks of a much tighter target, and they opened fire with everything they had. I watched 11 Vorkai warships go dark in 4 minutes, not destroyed, disabled. Owen was targeting their propulsion and navigation system specifically, which was a stranger choice than killing them outright, but I was too focused on the speed of it to question the reasoning. Yet the Vorka commander responded intelligently. He split his formation, pulling the right wing out and around to flank us. This was correct. This was the right move. Against any other fleet in that debris field it would have worked. Owen had left 2 ships that the Vorkai had barely registered, small fast vessels running silent with minimal power signatures, positioned exactly where the right wing would have to move through. The moment the Vorkai ships entered that space, those 2 ships came alive and fired not at the holes of the larger vessels but at their sensor arrays. Blind ships in a debris field do not move effectively. 3 of them collided with each other within the first 2 minutes. I became aware at some point that I was gripping the railing in front of me. I do not remember reaching for it. The battle was not clean. I want to be clear about that because what I am describing may sound like a performance, like something choreographed, and it was not. 2 of our ships took serious fire in the middle phase of the engagement. One of them, the carrier Halford, lost its port engines entirely and began rotating slowly in place, unable to control its own movement. A lesser crew would have abandoned the engagement to manage the rotation. The Halford's crew instead used the rotation. Their gunners calculated the spin rate, timed their firing solutions around it, and continued to fight with the kind of improvisation that I had no frame of reference for. Owen watched the Halford on his display and said nothing. He did not order them to withdraw. He did not send instructions on how to manage their situation. He watched them solve it themselves, and his expression was not blank as I had initially thought. It was something I had to look at for several seconds before I could name it. He was proud of them. In the middle of a battle with 12 ships against 200, he was standing there being proud of his people. Then there was the incident with Lieutenant Darren Cole. Darren Cole was a pilot on a small two-person gunship called the Sable, and at the 40-minute mark of the battle, his engine systems failed completely due to a cascade fault. From a near miss, the Sable was in the middle of a run that was supposed to pull fire away from the Halford, and without engines, he was a stationary target in the worst possible position. He did not panic. He told Owen what had happened in a voice so level I initially thought it was a damage report from an automated system. Then he said, "I still have forward momentum. Request permission to continue the run without power." Owen said, "Permission granted. Felix, tell the Harrow to move to intercept position 7. Darren Cole used the momentum of his dead ship to complete the run. He passed so close to a Vorkai warship that the hull cameras recorded the surface of it in detail. He drew their fire for 90 seconds, and then the Harrow came in from the angle Owen had sent it to, and the Vorkai vessel that had been concentrating on Darren Cole found itself under fire from a direction it had not been tracking. Darren Cole survived. He and his co-pilot sat in a dead ship in the middle of a debris field for the remainder of the battle until a recovery shuttle could reach them. Owen spoke to him once more during the engagement. A brief exchange. I was not close enough to hear, and Darren Cole's voice on the open channel after that had a quality to it that I could only describe as complete fearlessness, not recklessness. Fearlessness, there is a difference, and I had not understood the difference until I heard it in that voice. The Vorkai command cluster, watching the systematic destruction of their formation, made the decision to withdraw. At the 90-minute mark, this was by itself historic. The Vorkai had not withdrawn from an engagement in 11 years. Their doctrine did not include retreat. It was not something their commanders were trained to do, which meant the commander of this fleet was making a personal decision born of something I recognized across species lines. He was afraid. 47 Vorkai ships were destroyed. 91 were damaged enough to be out of the war for months, many of them disabled rather than killed, which I now understood. Disabled ships had to be recovered by other Vorai vessels. Recovery used time and resources. It was not mercy, it was calculation. When the last Vorkai ship cleared the debris field and vanished into a jump sequence, the bridge of the Ardent became very loud. I had been in military command spaces during moments of victory before. Aloyan officers celebrate with formal acknowledgments and recorded commendations and the dignified pressing of palms What happened on the bridge of the Ardent was nothing like that. It was noise and movement and someone grabbing someone else by the shoulders and Felix Strand laughing at something in a way that suggested it had been building in him for the entire 90 minutes, and Claire spinning once in her chair and then immediately pulling up her post-engagement system checks because the work was not finished just because the shooting was. Owen turned from the display. He was not celebrating, he was scanning the room, counting faces, making sure everyone was present and intact. He met my eyes across the bridge. I had expected him to look triumphant. Commanders who win historic victories look triumphant. It is natural, it is earned. He looked tired. Not defeated, not deflated, just deeply tired, in the way of a person who has spent every resource they had and is already tallying the cost of spending it. He held my gaze for a moment, then he nodded at me, a small motion almost private, and turned back to manage the aftermath of the battle. I stood at that railing and did not move for a long time. The room was loud around me and I could not hear any of it. There was something happening in my chest that I did not have proper words for in any of the 4 languages I spoke. I had watched this man take 12 ships into a field against 200 and bring them all home, not perfectly, not without cost. The Halford would need months of repair. Darren Cole would have nightmares. He would not talk about. Every person on these 12 ships would carry something from today for the rest of their lives. But they were alive, all of them. I thought about the conquered admirals in their chamber talking about acceptable losses and defensive lines and the mathematics of acceptable sacrifice. I thought about the 11 years of retreating. I thought about bait miners. 14,000 people now living under Vorai control. I thought about Owen Calloway reading books about old mistakes late into the night on a ship nobody important expected to matter. The conquered High Council received the battle record 6 hours later. My aide told me they watched it in complete silence, all 9 senior admirals from beginning to end. Then they watched it again. Then the session was adjourned without a single formal statement being entered into the record. My aide asked if I wanted to send a personal report to the High House. I told her I needed more time, that I was still processing what I had seen. This was true. What I did not tell her, because I was not yet sure how to say it, was that I had arrived on this ship looking for information about a species that my civilization had never taken seriously. I had arrived looking for data to report back about the military capabilities of a Tier 3 people we had attached to our war for political convenience. What I had found standing on this bridge watching a tired man scan the faces of his crew to make sure they were all still there was something I had no category for, something that had rearranged itself inside me without asking permission. I stayed at the railing until the bridge cleared, and then I walked to the observation deck alone and looked at the debris field around us, at the dark shapes of disabled Vorai ships turning slowly in the quiet, and I said nothing to no one and tried to understand what I had just witnessed. It took me a very long time. When I finally went back to my quarters, I opened my official report document and stared at the blank space where my analysis was supposed to go. I wrote 3 sentences. I deleted them. I wrote them again. I closed the document. Without saving it, I would need to find new words. The old ones did not fit Anymore, the Conquered did not give Owen command of the combined fleet. Immediately. That would have been too direct, too clean, and the Conquered High Council was a body that operated the way old architecture operates. It did not change its shape for new things. It made small adjustments and called them transformations. What they gave him first was consultation status, then they gave him a strategic advisory role, then, over the course of 6 weeks, they gave him more ships to coordinate with until the number of vessels under his effective direction had grown from 12 to 40, and then to 90, and then one morning, a senior admiral named Counselor V. Therick arrived aboard the Ardent in a formal delegation and presented Owen with a set of orders that in the careful language of the Conquered bureaucracy amounted to full command of a combined fleet. He was the first non-conquered species officer to hold that authority in the Alliance's history. Owen read the orders twice, thanked the counselor formally, and then went to the operations center to begin working. He did not celebrate. He did not make a speech. Felix Strand made a quiet announcement to the ship that the commander had been given the combined fleet, and the crew responded with a single coordinated sound that was half cheer and half something more serious. And then everyone went back to work. I watched this from the corridor outside the operations center and thought about what it meant for a people to receive enormous news and turn it immediately into labor. My own culture holds ceremony for every significant transition. The appointment would have required a reception, formal acknowledgments from the senior house, recorded vows of responsibility. We mark our changes publicly because we believe the marking creates the meaning. Owen apparently believed the work created the meaning. The appointment was real when he acted on it, not when he stood still to receive it. I was learning to tell the difference between our ways without deciding one was wrong. The weeks that followed the Battle of Keth Vaughan, as it was being called now, were the most politically complex of my life. I say this as someone who grew up in the Allen High House, where complex politics is the primary environment. The Conquered admirals who had voted for the retreat and been proven immediately wrong were not the sort of people who accepted being proven wrong gracefully. They operated through channels and procedures and the careful management of resource flow, and Owen operated in a space that they technically controlled. The first sign was supply delays. The combined fleet was authorized to draw from Conquered logistical depots, but the processing times for those requests began stretching. An ammunition resupply that should have taken 48 hours took 11 days. A request for replacement sensor arrays for the Halford disappeared into the system entirely and had to be filed 3 separate times. The second sign was altered orders. Twice in the first month, Owen received engagement directives from Conquered Command that did not match the intelligence he had been given earlier in the same week. The targets had shifted slightly. The timelines had compressed in ways that made his preferred approach impossible. He would have had to improvise from a weaker position, which would mean more risk to his people. He did not confront anyone. He did not file a formal complaint. He used the altered orders as opportunities to propose alternative plans, carefully worded to make the Conquered admirals feel that the adjustment had been their idea. He wrote those proposals himself late at night in his quarters in language so smooth and differential that I read one over his shoulder once and had to read it twice before I understood what he had actually accomplished with it. He had gotten everything he wanted, and the Admiral, receiving the proposal, felt like he had done Owen a favor. I told him that was the most elegant piece of political writing I had ever read, and I had read documents drafted by a lawyer and high counselors who had been practicing the form for 60 years. Owen looked mildly surprised, and then he smiled the way he smiled when something pleased him. Quietly, I just try to give people a way to say yes, he said. Most people want to say yes. They just need a door to walk through. This was when I began to understand something about him that I had been circling without seeing directly. Owen Callaway was not simply a tactical genius in the narrow sense of moving ships around a battlefield. He was a complete strategist, which meant he saw the political landscape and the logistical landscape and the human landscape as parts of the same map. He fought on all of them simultaneously, and he fought on each of them with the same principle: find the path where everyone can move forward. It was a kind of intelligence I had been trained to recognize but had rarely seen exercised at this level. I also, during this period, became useful. This had not been part of the plan. I had come aboard to observe and report. I had not been intended to participate, but I knew the Concord's internal structures in a way Owen did not. I knew which families held influence over which admirals. I knew the histories and alliances that shaped the Concord's senior bureaucracy, the grievances and debts that went back generations. I knew how to move through those structures, so when a supply authorization was being held by an administrator who happened to be from a house that owed a significant diplomatic debt to the Aloysian throne, I made a communication. I did not threaten. I simply reminded the authorization was processed within 2 hours. I did this 3 more times over the following weeks. Each time I told Owen afterward. Each time he was quiet for a moment, and then me in a way that was specific about what I had done and why it mattered. Not a general thank you for your help. He named the action. He named the result. He treated me as a colleague. No one in my life had treated me as a colleague before. I had been a princess, a symbol, a diplomatic instrument. I had been respected and admired and carefully managed. I had not been someone whose specific action was named and valued by another person who was in the middle of fighting a war. I noticed what that felt like. I paid attention to it. 3 more major engagements took place over the following 4 months. I will not describe them all in the detail I gave to Keth Vaughn, but I will say this: they were each different. Owen did not have a style in the way that most commanders have a style. He had principles, which is different. The principle was always to find the specific weakness of the specific situation, which meant every battle looked different from the outside. You could not watch him fight twice and predict how he would fight a third time. And this was, I came to understand, his most dangerous quality. The Vorkai are ancient and experienced and organized. They had fought hundreds of civilizations. They had libraries of tactical patterns. They knew how the Elone fought, how the Sorv fought, how every species in the Concord approached combat. They could counter what they had seen before. Owen never gave them something they had seen before. Word of this spread through the Vorkai command structure, and the effect was visible in their behavior. they began routing ships around human-held sectors. They began requesting intelligence on Owen's position before committing to engagements. They had a name for him, which their intercepted communications rendered in translation as something close to the one who does not fight the same way. This was the first time in the 11-year war that the Vora had named a specific enemy commander in their communications. Other human commanders were emerging too. Owen had been quietly working with them for months, sharing his approach, not his specific tactics, his approach, the way he thought, the questions he asked before a battle, the things he looked for. They were not copies of him. They were becoming something else, a new kind of officer shaped by a new kind of thinking, and the combined effect of them operating in different sectors was beginning to stretch the Vorhi in ways their logistics had never had to manage before. Then they took one of Owen's people. Lieutenant Petra Kane was a signals intelligence officer on a scout vessel called the Meridian that was operating in advance of the main fleet. The Vora had adjusted their approach vectors specifically to intercept scout routes, which told Owen they were learning and adapting, and the Meridian ran into a contact it could not avoid. The crew escaped. Petra Kane did not. The Vora broadcast the fact of her capture on an open channel within 6 hours. The message was directed at Owen. Specifically, the translation was cease operations in sectors 7-2 for 30 days, or the prisoner would be processed. Prode had a specific meaning in Vora doctrine. I did not need to explain it to anyone on the bridge. The Concord's response doctrine was clear. Prisoners taken by the Vorkai were considered lost. The Concord did not negotiate. Concord did not mount recovery operations for single captured personnel because the strategic cost was too high. You expressed regret. You recorded the name and you continued. This was not cruelty, it was arithmetic. I was in Owen's office when the message came through. He read it on his screen and was very still for a long moment. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, "She's been with us for 3 years," I said. Nothing. I watched him. He pulled up a system map. He began working, not planning a compliance with a Vorkai demand, not filing a report with the Concord, planning a rescue. He called his senior staff in. He laid it out for them. He told them the risks clearly, and without softening them, he told them there was a real possibility that operation would fail and people would not come home. He told them he would understand if any of them thought the strategic calculus did not support it. Every single person in that room was completely quiet when he finished speaking. Then his tactical officer, a steady-voiced man named Oliver Grant, said, "What do we need, sir?" Not as a question, as the beginning of a list. That was all. No debate, no hesitation. I went to the Concord Council chamber. The following day, I asked for a private audience with 3 of the senior admirals, the 3 whose families had the most reason to maintain positive relations with the alone throne. I did not ask them to support the rescue operation. I asked them to not obstruct it. I explained carefully that Commander Calloway was the single most effective military asset the Concord had, that his people would fight for him because he fought for his people, and that the arithmetic of that arrangement was not the same arithmetic as the standard doctrine assumed. They were quiet when I finished. One of them said it was an unusual use of a princess's authority. I told him it was an unusual war. They did not obstruct the operation. They also did not support it officially. Owen operated in a space between their silence and his own will, which seemed to be a space he was comfortable in. Petra Kane came home 11 days later. She was thinner. She was injured in ways that would take months to heal, but she walked off the shuttle under her own power, and every person on the ardent landing deck was there to see it, and the sound they made when she appeared at the shuttle door was the kind of sound that does not come from training or doctrine or any military principle I had ever been taught. It came from something older and simpler. She was theirs, and they had brought her back, and that was all there was to it. Owen shook her hand. At the bottom of the ramp, he said something to her that I was close enough to hear. He said, "Welcome home, Petra." She said, "Good to be back, sir." That was it. That was the entire exchange. And I stood there watching it and felt something happen in my throat that was entirely undignified for an Awen princess of the third house. That evening, I recorded my official report to the High Council. I had been composing it in pieces for months, adjusting it, revising my assessments. I had been trained to write reports that were precise and measured, and dispassionate data analysis. Recommendation: I wrote something different this time. I wrote about what I had seen in that landing bay, wrote about the arithmetic the Conquered used for individuals and why Owen's different. Arithmetic was not a strategic weakness, but a strategic weapon. I wrote about what it meant for a military unit when the people inside it believed with complete certainty that they would not be abandoned. I wrote that humanity fought differently, not because of their ships or their tactics or their tolerance for improvisation, though all of those things were real. They fought differently because they refused at a level that seemed to go below policy and below doctrine and below even conscious decision to treat a person beside them as a number on an acceptable loss table. I wrote that this was the most dangerous quality I had ever observed in a military force. I filed the report. Then I sat in my quarters for a long time, and I thought about the woman I had been when I boarded this ship. The careful observer, the political instrument, the princess doing her duty with appropriate detachment. I thought about the fact that I had spent royal political capital to clear a path for a rescue mission for a human signals officer I had never spoken to. I thought about Owen at the bottom of that ramp saying 2 words that meant everything. I had told the High Council I was defending a commander's strategic value. I believed that was true when I said it. I was now not certain it was the whole truth. I was not certain what the rest of the truth was yet, but I was beginning to suspect it was something that would require entirely new words to say. When the Vorai came with everything, there was no warning that this time was different. There had been fleet movements for weeks, which was not unusual. There had been increased activity along 3 separate border sectors, which the Conquered's analysts had read as a broad pressure campaign, an attempt to stretch our defensive lines thin before a concentrated strike. Somewhere, this analysis was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. What the Vorai were actually doing was assembling the largest single combat force they had put together in the entire 11-year war. 2,140 ships, every class, their oldest warships and their newest carrier groups, and destroyer screens, and the heavy siege vessels they reserved for planetary reduction, which meant they were not planning to take whatever they hit next, they were planning to end something. Owen saw 6 hours before the Concord's intelligence directorate did. He had been tracking micro-adjustments in Vorkai logistical transit patterns. For weeks, small things, the kind of things that only resolve into a picture. If you are looking for a picture rather than for individual data points, when he brought his assessment to me that morning, setting his data pad on the table between us with the map on the screen, I looked at it for a long time. Then I looked at him. He said, "They're coming for us specifically, not a sector us." I asked how long we had. He said, "They're staging now, maybe 4 days." We had 340 ships at that time. The combined fleet had grown considerably since Cathon, but 340 against 2,140 was arithmetic that should have broken something in the room. It did not seem to be breaking anything in Owen. He was already working on his data pad before I finished processing the numbers. I went to the Concord Council within the hour. I used every piece of authority and connection I had, every favor and every obligation and every relationship I had cultivated in months aboard this fleet. I got them what they needed, not more ships. There were none to spare from the defensive lines without collapsing them, but I got resupply prioritized. I got authorization for access to 2 emergency munitions caches that had been locked behind council approval. I got the bureaucratic obstructions that had been quietly accumulating against Owen's fleet dissolved in 48 hours. When I came back to the Ardent, Owen was in the operations center with his senior staff and the senior officers of the combined fleet, and the briefing was already in progress. I stood at the back and listened to him lay out the plan. It took 3 hours. He had been building it for longer than I knew. There were elements of it that he had designed weeks before, positions he had pre-staged under the guise of other movements, sensor arrangements in specific spatial coordinates that only now revealed their purpose, pieces of a pattern that had looked like separate decisions until they were all shown together. Oliver Grant, sitting at the briefing table, was nodding slowly at one point with the expression of someone who has just understood a joke that was set up several minutes earlier. I had the same feeling. He had been planning this since before the Vorkai decided to come for him. He had been planning it. I realized since Keth Vaughn he had known that winning that battle the way he won it, destroying that formation that cleanly would force the Vorhi to make a decision. He had known what decision they would eventually make. He had used the entire intervening period to prepare for the decision he had pushed them toward. I did not say anything until after the briefing, when the operation center had cleared and only the 2 of us remained. I said, "You engineered this." He looked at me. He didn't confirm or deny it immediately, which was its own kind of answer. I said, "You needed them to bring everything. Battle against a partial force wins campaign. A battle against everything, if it goes right, ends the war." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I needed them to stop being a long war and become a short one. Long wars grind down the people doing the grinding. Mine have been grinding for a long time." I thought about 412 people on this ship. I thought about 340 ships and every person in every one of them who had been in this war for years. I thought about what that length of time does to people, the weight it puts down in them that never fully lifts. He had been looking for a way to end it, not when it ended. There is a difference. I told him I would be on the bridge. He said, I know. The 4 days before the engagement were the strangest of my life. The ardent was not quiet. It was never quiet. But the particular quality of sound changed. There was more music than usual. I do not entirely understand human music, but I have learned that it does specific work for them, that they use it to hold something together inside themselves. When circumstances are trying to pull it apart, I heard it coming from corridors and mess halls and maintenance bays at all hours. I heard the dark jokes which I had come to understand as a human method of saying, I'm afraid and I trust you enough to say so without saying it directly. I saw people writing on paper, in some cases, letters they were leaving somewhere safe. I did not ask about this. I understood it. Owen slept 4 hours a night for those 4 days and spent the rest of his time in the operations center or walking the ship. He walked the ship every evening, the whole length of it, stopping to talk to people, not briefings, conversations. He asked about the letter writer's family. He sat with Claire Rowe for 20 minutes while she ate and talked about something that made her laugh twice. He sat with the Halliford's repair crew who had come over for cross-training and spent 40 minutes talking with them about their ship and what she had been through and whether she was ready. He was the same person in every conversation, fully present, fully himself, not performing anything for anyone. By the 4th night, I had stopped finding excuses for why I needed to be wherever he was. The Vorkai fleet arrived at the edge of our sensor range at 200 station time on the 5th day. 2140 ships rendered in red on the main display. The number was so large that the display algorithm had simplified them to a mass shape rather than individual markers. Our 340 individual markers, white, spread across a region of space that Owen had chosen. With the same careful reasoning he brought to everything, I stood at my position on the bridge. I was not there as an observer anymore. I was not there as a political representative. I did not have a formal role. I was simply a person who intended to see this through to its end with the people who had made it their mission. Owen looked at the display, then he looked around the bridge at his people. He did not make a speech. He said, let's bring everyone home. That was all. The battle lasted 3 days. I cannot describe 3 days of continuous combat in the way I described Kethvon. The scale is wrong for that kind of description. What I can tell you is what I saw and what I felt, and I will try to be honest about both. The first day was the kind of engagement where Owen's preparation showed most clearly. The Vorkai, despite their enormous numbers, could not bring all of them to bear at once in the region Owen had chosen. He had positioned us in a narrow corridor of navigable space between 2 gravitational anomalies, and the Vorkia's advantage in numbers meant nothing if they could not spread out to use it. They had to come at us in depth rather than width, which was like a flood trying to pour through a tube. The front end of their force hit us hard, but it was manageable. The weight behind it was the threat, and Owen had been planning for that weight for months. He had allies in positions the Vorkai did not know about yet. 3 conquered fleets that had been repositioned to look like defensive assignments were actually staged behind the Vorkai's axis of advance. They could not strike yet, without revealing themselves too early. The timing required patience that I did not know I was capable of until I had to exercise it. We lost 4 ships in the first 12 hours. I knew some of their crew by name. This is the weight of being present rather than observing. You do not get to keep the distance of analysis. You feel the losses as losses, specific and real, and you carry them forward into the next hour and the next. Owen felt them too. I watched him receive each damage and casualty report. He did not perform stoicism, he simply absorbed it and kept working, but between reports, the spa of seconds, something moved across his face that was honest and unguarded. He was paying attention to every cost. The second day was the hardest. The Vore Grand Admiral, whose name translated to something like the unyielding, understood by the middle of the second day that the engagement was not developing as expected. He began adapting. He pulled his heaviest ships to the front and started a direct pressure campaign that was less elegant than Vore doctrine usually preferred, essentially trying to overwhelm us through mass rather than formation. It was the move of a commander who had abandoned refinement for urgency. It almost worked. There was a period of 4 hours in the middle of the second day when 3 of our capital ships were simultaneously in critical condition, and Owen was managing all 3 situations while also running the overall engagement. He was injured twice during this period, a coolant failure in a corridor he happened to be passing through, a secondary explosion from a hit on our deck 7 that caught him when he was in the wrong place. He moved to the medical station near the operation center and continued working from there. The doctor who was treating him, a young, red-haired man named Cal Norris, told me later that Owen had not stopped talking for the 3 hours he was under treatment, directing, adjusting, receiving information, making decisions. Cal Norris told me he had never seen anything like it. I told him I had learned to stop being surprised. Late on the second day, I sat on the floor of the corridor outside the medical station and thought about all the things I had arrived on the ship believing. I had believed humanity was a minor species, useful in limited contexts, not to be taken seriously as a civilization. I had believed my assignment here was observation. I had believed marriage to a human officer was a political necessity and nothing more. I sat there and tried to remember what it had felt like to believe those things, and I could not fully reach it. It was like trying to remember being cold when you are standing in warmth. The memory is real, but the sensation no longer is. Owen emerged from the medical station at hour 19 of the second day with his left arm in a support brace and the same look on his face as always, tired and present, and entirely focused on the next thing. He saw me on the floor of the corridor. He sat down next to me. He did not ask if I was all right because he could see that I was. He sat with me for 3 minutes in the noise and light of the ship, managing its own crisis around us, and in those 3 minutes we did not talk at all. I did not need us to. The third day was when the war ended. Owen had held the 3 conquered fleets in reserve through everything, through the losses and the pressure and the 4 hours of near disaster on day 2. He had held them when every tactical instinct would have called for deploying them sooner, because he needed them for one specific moment that he had calculated would arrive at a specific place in the Vorai. Grand Admiral's decision-making. Commander who has been pressing hard and not breaking what should be breakable. Will eventually overextend, he will push. One more time more committed than before because he cannot accept that the thing in front of him is not moving. He will lean forward into that push with more weight than is wise, the unyielding. Pushed at 340, on the third day Owen deployed all three conquered fleets. Simultaneously at 341, they came from behind the Vorkai axis of advance. They came from the flanks. They came from an angle that had been left open, specifically because a closing angle would have told the Vorkai it was a trap. Owen had left it open and trusted that the Grand Admiral would use it, which he did, which meant his heaviest ships were committed forward with nothing positioned to turn and respond. The Vorkai fleet did not retreat this time. It could not. It was surrounded on three sides with a gravitational anomaly. At its back, what it did was fragment, which is what happens to a formation when it loses coherent command, and fragmented ships in a combat zone are not a fleet anymore. They are individual problems, and individual problems can be managed. The Unyielding's flagship went dark at 11:17 station time on the third day. At 12:03, the remaining Vorkai vessels began transmitting a signal that our translators identified as their version of cessation of hostilities, not surrender. The Vorkai did not have a word for surrender, but they had a word for stop, and they were using it. The battle was over. The war was over. The Bridge of the Ardent was very quiet for a long moment after the last Vora transmission. I think everyone needed a second to understand what they were experiencing. Silence in a combat bridge after 3 days means one of two things, and they needed to confirm which. Then Felix Strand said softly, confirmed. Vorai fleet full cessation signal across all remaining vessels, and then the noise came, the kind of noise that has no word in any language I know for what it is. Not celebration exactly. Something bigger than celebration and more complicated than relief. Something that belongs to people who have been in a very long dark place and have just seen light. Owen was still at the medical station when it ended. Oliver Grant had insisted he return there. After he heard the cessation signal, I went to find him. He was sitting on the edge of a medical cot with his arm resting in the support brace and his eyes closed, and he was not sleeping. He was just still. The first time I had seen him completely still in 3 days. I sat in the chair across from him. He heard me and opened his eyes. I did not know what to say. I had 4 languages between us, and I could not find the words in any of them for what I wanted to say. He said, "Are you all right?" Not "we won," not "it's over." "Are you all right?" I told him yes. I asked if he was. He thought about it, which I respected. He did not answer automatically. He said, "I will be. I need to see the full casualty count first." I nodded. We sat there in the medical station with the sound of the ship changing around us as the news moved through it, as 340 ships full of people received the same information and began Clear's throat. The same long process of returning from wherever war takes you to. I asked him what the signal was, the one his people were transmitting. I had been told all 340 ships were sending it simultaneously. He had apparently taught every Allied crew to send it. He was quiet for a moment, then he said it was An old naval tradition. Before radio, before long-range communication, when a fleet came back from an engagement, each ship would fire a signal gun as it came into harbor. One shot, just one. It meant I am here, I made it back. He had translated it into an electromagnetic signal format. He had taught every Allied crew to send it simultaneously. When the engagement concluded, I thought about 340 ships, human and Allen and so of the 9 other species, all sending the same signal at the same moment, all saying the same thing in a language that belonged to sailors on an ocean, on a planet that only humanity had ever seen. I am here, I made it back. I had spent my life learning that strength is what you carry, status and lineage and the weight of a great name. These things are real and they matter. I do not dismiss them, but sitting in that medical station with the signal still going out across 340 ships, I understood something that I could not have understood before I came aboard this vessel, before I watched these people, before I watched him. Strength is also what you carry forward for someone else. The certainty that another person matters, the absolute refusal to leave them behind, the readiness to be afraid and to show up anyway because someone beside you is relying on it. Humanity was not strong because of their weapons or their tactics or their tolerance for improvisation in the middle of chaos. Though all of these things were completely real, humanity was strong because they had somehow looked at the universe large and cold and indifferent and decided without any guarantee of being right that the person next to them was worth every cost. And when you believe that completely and without condition, you become very difficult to stop. Owen was looking at me. He had been watching me think through something, which I had apparently been doing. Visibly, I told him I had been trying to find the right words. He asked what for. I looked at this tired, bandaged, completely undefeated man and thought about a princess who had boarded a human ship with a data pad full of official objectives and left every single one of them behind somewhere in the past 8 months without noticing exactly when. I said, for all of it. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he said, take your time, I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the signal was still going out. 340 ships, old words in a new shape. Sound that said, we are here, we came home. I had been sent to bind a tier 3 species to war. They were expected to fight as useful instruments and nothing more. I had been sent with cool objectives and a return date and a clear sense of what I would find, what no one had prepared me for, what I do not think anyone could have prepared me for. Was this the specific and irreducible fact of a people who had looked at a war that was meant to consume them and decided without drama and without hesitation that they would carry every single person through it, or they would not stop trying. They sent me to observe a lesser species. What I found was something I will spend the rest of my long alone life trying to be worthy of. I found people who believed that nobody was expendable, and once you have seen what that belief can do, once you have stood inside it and been held by it, there is no going back to a world where you did not know it existed. The signal went out across the quiet dark. We came home.